I'd like to welcome Charlie Taylor, who's the Chief Inspector of Prisons. As I mentioned before, Charlie's going to talk about his priorities and goals for the next 5 years. I mean, Charlie's had, I guess, quite an extensive involvement in criminal justice, from leading the kind of review on youth justice, which made quite wide-ranging recommendations for the introduction of secure schools. And of course, in 2017, he became chair of the Youth Justice Board, overseeing the youth justice system, advising ministers from across Whitehall. And more recently, since the 1st of November last year, he's taken on the role of Chief Inspector of Prisons. So over to you, Charlie, and thank you very much for joining us today.
That's very kind. Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. And it's really nice to be here and to meet some of whom are old friends I'm seeing on the call here who I've known for many years, but also other member organisations and other people who I'll be looking forward, I'm sure, to meet at this event and similar events, and particularly when we get to the opportunity to meet face to face, which with any luck won't be too far away. So thank you for having me. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes or so not very long, and then give you a chance to ask questions, because I know lots of you will have things that you'll want to raise. As Kevin said, I've had a sort of, well, beginning to be a longish background in this area. I was originally head teacher of a special school for children with emotional and behavioural difficulties, as it was then known. And that gave me very much an interest into this area of policy, and I think some insights into the sorts of reasons why children end up in the criminal justice system, both as children and as adults. And interestingly, I'm in contact with an ex-pupil of mine who sadly is doing 11 years at the moment in prison for a serious offence. And it's a really interesting example. I've got a photograph of him on my computer at home where he's in the end of term carol service, and he's singing his heart out and doing an amazing job. He had a lovely voice, was a bright kid. And it's just a lovely picture of a boy enjoying himself and expressing himself, and you know, with the potential of a bright future in front of him. But he did come from also an extremely troubled background and was convicted of a serious offence. And I looked at the offence because it was recorded on someone's dash cam. It was happened outdoors, and it's a really serious offence. And if you saw that, you might easily write that boy off as a dangerous thug who needs to be put away. But knowing him personally, knowing his potential, knowing his background, knowing what he's capable of, knowing what a delightful boy he is, and you know, we correspond regularly from where he's locked up. It's just a reminder of the journey that many people have been on before they end up in prison, and it helps me in my job here just to focus on and to continue to focus on what really matters, which is ultimately improving outcomes for prisoners and people who end up in prison, in order that when they come out, they can have a safe and successful life, and particularly that communities are kept safe and we see fewer victims of crime. So I'll just talk briefly about some of my priorities. I think the first thing really coming into an organisation like this is to maintain the reputation that it already has. It is in a way sort of akin to the All Black rugby team have a tradition whereby you don't get to wear the shirt, you just inherit it for a bit, and your job is to look after the shirt until you pass it on to the person who replaces you further down the line. And I feel very much that's an important part of my role here, that this is an organisation through the work of my predecessors as chief inspectors, all of whom I've spoken to, or all of whom who are still alive, I've spoken to at length over the course of the last few months, who have done an amazing job over time, and also the staff of building up this organisation into an independent, strong, fearless, knowledgeable, well-respected team that is able to provide impartial reporting to government, to Parliament, to wider stakeholders, to prisoners' families, about the state of things in custody, about conditions and treatment of people who find themselves in custody. And for me, one of the delights of this job has been taking on such an incredibly functioning and successful organization. And I am daily impressed by the dedication and hard work of the team. It's no surprise when you meet the people that they've continued in the field despite the pandemic being in place, and barely missed a step between the beginning of lockdown and beginning the first SSV short scrutiny visits in June last year. So it's a real tribute to the people in the organisation. And one of my priorities is simply to maintain, and I hope to build on, the reputation that the organisation has. The second thing, the second thing that inevitably will be hugely important is the pandemic and what happens as a result of the pandemic. We put out a report, which if you haven't seen, I would commend to you, called What Happened to Prisoners During the Pandemic, which was in effect an ethnography. We interviewed 72 prisoners in 6 different prisons and asked them, including women's prisons and children, and asked them how they were experiencing the pandemic. And it was really fascinating and very sad, actually, to hear about their experiences. There is this malaise that I think has overcome prisoners, this sense of hopelessness and helplessness, that they're not making progress with their sentences, that they're able to demonstrate that their behavior is improving, that they can't stay in contact in a meaningful way with family and friends, despite the excellent work the prison service has done to improve the quality of technology. But nevertheless, they feel incredibly stuck. They're not having access to education or to training or the sorts of rehabilitation activity that will help them to be successful when they come out. We saw in the course of the summer, initially prisoners were accepting of a lockdown and lockdown conditions. They knew this was happening to everybody. They themselves were nervous about the pandemic and were grateful for the protection. But what we saw over the course of the summer was that some prisoners were really ambitious about the pace by which they unlocked and began to get things back to normal, somewhere like Bristol. And then we saw other places like Earlstoke, where really very little progress had been made in terms of getting prisoners out of their cell, beginning to introduce some normality. So my first priority is really that as we begin to get back to full inspections in the spring, that we are looking to see the pace at which prisons begin to open up again. We are keen that as soon as it's safe, that the prison service and prisons are ambitious about the pace, that they learn the lessons from what happened in the summer, and they can get back to a semblance of normality as soon as possible. The other thing we're interested in seeing, that there's lots of talk about how a regime could be different as a result of some of the stuff that people have learned from the pandemic, and we'll want to see that policy as it developed, and to make sure that we continue to hold whatever policy or regime it is to the same standards that we currently do. And from a personal point of view, it's about getting us as an organisation back and up and running again in a meaningful way, and an opportunity for me to meet people who I feel I know very well, but I've yet to meet on my team. The second area where I'm interested, and I think we can do some more, is about leadership and the way that we report on leadership. Now, of course, leadership's always been a focus of HMIP reports, but it's something that I'm looking at with the team and considering ways that we can focus a little bit more on leadership. We know that leadership standards are one of the most important things that helps a prison to get better. The reason that Bristol was able to unlock prisoners, have 50% of prisoners in work every day, was because of the drive and ambition, not only of the governor, but also of the PGD, original PGD, who was supporting the work that he was doing. So I think paying attention to leadership seems appropriate, given it's one of the most important factors in improving a prison. But I think not just leadership at governor level, but also leadership above governors, but also below governors, so the deputy governors, and then really down to middle leadership out on the wings. The difference that a really great CM makes to the quality of life of a wing, the difference a really good CM makes to the morale of the officers and the staff who are working there is absolutely enormous. And I'm very keen that we do as much as we can to focus in on that really good practice when we see it. The next area, which is, I think, actually enormously important, is about the use of data and the way in which data is used and processed. And I think the inspectorate can play a useful part here. When I was a head teacher years ago, schools used to, 20 or so years ago, schools used to not collect much data. Then they began to collect huge amounts of data, but they didn't know what to do with it. And it wasn't always used in an effective way of monitoring and changing, setting priorities, monitoring, and then and reviewing progress. Schools have come an enormous way now, and data has become an absolutely integral part of schools understanding their performance. And Ofsted, as the schools inspectorate, played a really important part in that. To some extent, I think the prison service lags behind here a bit. So I think lots of data is collected, but I think it's not always used in the most effective way, which is understanding what's going on, making plans, monitoring plans, and then understanding whether plans have been successful. And of course, data isn't the be all and end all. Data is simply a means to an end. But I think refined use of data will help people in prioritizing what they do in prisons. And I think will also help us with leads that we follow when we go in and inspect. There will be no substitute for being on the ground, for talking to prisoners, for following leads when we go around prisoners, for talking to officers, for looking and watching the regime in action. But I think developing the way that data is used, I think, is potentially enormously important. And then the final thing that sort of inevitably interests me is about education and the way in which prison education, in the widest sense of the word, how effective that is. So the way in which prisoners' needs are really being met by education that's provided in custody. Of course, this is something that's outsourced to our colleagues in Ofsted, and I look forward to working closely with them in order to consider that. So I won't go into too much more detail now, because I'm sure you've got lots of questions that you want to ask. There's a quick sort of skim through some of the priorities that I've got, and then really to hand over to you and to hear what questions you've got.
Thanks very much for that, Charlie. So if people have got questions they'd like to raise or ask Charlie, could you do that kind of virtual hand thing if you can find it, and or you can do a physical thing where you can actually raise your hand and I'll see if I can spot it. But does anyone have a question that they'd like to sort of start off? Okay, let's start with Tim Connolly. So hopefully JB can, as it were, unmute Tim and release his voice. If that's okay. There we go. Okay, Tim, over to you.
Thanks very much. Tim Connolly, I'm the Policy and Campaigns Manager at Spark Inside. We provide life coaching for young men in the criminal justice system.
I know, yeah, I know your work very well. I used to know Bailey back in the day.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Charlie. That was really, really helpful. I'm really interested in the point around data. And I suppose I've been reflecting on the way that data is informed how we think about self-harm in the estate, and in particular about whether it's sufficiently granular. And I suppose that's in part what you might be thinking about. I'm just curious to hear, like, what are do you have any sort of tentative sense of some of the practical ways that operational performance might be encouraged to change through your work in the inspectorate, or what sort of data sets you might be thinking about? Yeah, it feels like having a more nuanced understanding of some of those emotional, social factors that end up in things like self-harm could be really helpful. So just interested to hear more.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think self-harm is a really interesting one, because it's one of those things that can be used as a proxy or a barometer for mental health across the prison. And I actually think that's entirely artificial, actually, because there are all kinds of reasons why people self-harm. Sometimes there are high levels of self-harm simply because one person is self-harming a lot. And the fact that self-harming is falling in a prison, I think, is no measure of the state of the mental health of prisoners themselves. And we've certainly seen that in the pandemic, where self-harm levels have went up and then have drifted down a bit. But there's no doubt that prisoners are suffering considerable mental stress. I think the trick with data is to not have so much that you're overwhelmed by it, and that can be so easily done. But to focus in on some key metrics which will help you to understand about the institution, and to then be able to trigger leads that you follow when you actually get into the prison, and to follow that. And I would expect it to be reasonably high level, but I would also expect that prisons themselves would be able to show me data that goes into more detail. So one of the things is that people thinking in more detail about areas which are priorities for them. So if they've got high levels of self-harm, if they're worried about mental health, which at the moment inevitably they should be, then really digging into what they're doing about mental health and the outcomes and the difference that it's making. And that data is one of the factors that helps them to be able to do that. But I think an over-reliance on data is also really risky too, because your data might look good, but underneath it, actually, there are some really worrying things. So data is a means to an end, but it can't be used. But it can't be used as a proxy for things that it can't cover.
Okay, thanks for that, Charlie. I don't know, Tim, did you have anything you wanted to say, perhaps back in response at all?
There we go. Sorry, that wasn't just me delaying bizarrely. Not really, just very quickly to say, yes, I think that's an important nuance, isn't it, around it not being a proxy for something else, and devil's inevitably in the detail. Yeah, that's it. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay. So anyone else have a question that they'd like to raise with Charlie? And I'll do my best.
There's some hands up there, yeah.
Okay, let's, I'm just trying to sort of...
John Drew, for example, I can see.
Aha. Okay, sorry, I missed you there, John. Okay, JB?
Thank you, Kevin. And Charlie, really welcome to our world, this version of our world. As you know, Charlie, I work with the Prison Reform Trust, and you're absolutely right about your predecessors. A whole series of really eminent and very brave people have occupied the post. And knowing you as I do, you will be the latest in that long line. A new person coming in has an opportunity to just challenge some things that maybe don't make sense but have been around for a long time. And one that I'd like to pose at you, I've never understood this. This isn't a funny question. I've just never understood how in the world of prison inspection, we seem to tolerate, as a whole system, the fact that when your inspectors go back into a prison, the first thing they do is look at how many of the previous recommendations haven't been implemented or have only been partly implemented. And there seems to be a sort of an acceptance that is going to be the case. It's not an acceptance within HMIP. There's no point in you making recommendations if they're not implemented. But the system as a whole seems to accept, well, that's the way we do things here. Now, Charlie, you and I are much more familiar with the Ofsted sort of approach to inspection, in which, frankly, if a significant number of recommendations are not implemented after an inspection at the time of the next one, heads roll. I'm not a fan of heads rolling, incidentally, but nevertheless, it's the lack of consequence. And I'm sure you're already familiar with that, but I would both welcome hearing your thoughts about it, and in particular, how we can get to a situation where there is a better relationship between recommendations, must-dos, and implementation.
Very good. Thanks, John, and lovely to see you, and look forward to working with you with the PRT. I agree, and it's something that I want to prioritise. So I'm changing the structure of our reports a little bit. So I'm trying to we're adapting it a little bit. So I want to use photographs in a slightly different way. I want to disperse them throughout the report in order to illustrate things. We're looking at some other amendments in the way that we report and the way we display our reporting. And one of the things that I want to focus in more on is exactly that, because I think we comment, I think we should be commenting more intensely, particularly on recommendations that, the most important recommendations, so the key concern type recommendations. I think one has to take into account the time lag on some of these. So sometimes it's 4 years on and things have moved on a long way, and the recommendation may apply, but it may not apply in quite the same way. But nevertheless, you're absolutely right. When in the comparison you make with education, where you get absolutely rinsed by Ofsted if recommendations haven't been taken on, and it's something that I'm very keen that we do more on and make more of it, in our reporting and our information gathering. So I hope you'll see some changes there when it comes to some of the developments we're going to make over the next months.
That's great. So I'm going to go to Philippa Budgeon, and then I think I've picked up a hands up from Val Corbett. I'll come to you afterwards. So Philippa, over to you.
Thank you. I'm here representing the Longford Trust. We provide scholarships for university education for prisoners and ex-prisoners. So one of the things that I'm really familiar with is the frustrations of digital connection. And I mean, that's not just, you'll know this isn't just from the prisoners themselves, but from the staff too. I've had many an agonised conversation with education staff who are just as frustrated as our scholars. And the question I have for you, because I know you've mentioned this in various reports, is how confident are you that this is really happening at the speed it needs to happen now?
It's a really interesting question, Philippa, and nice to meet you. I think one of the good things that's come out of the pandemic is that I think this has given a bit of a shock to this. And I think more progress has probably been made over the last 10 months than has been over the last few years. So I think that needs to be celebrated. I think the purple visits, notwithstanding some of the technical difficulties, notwithstanding some of the problems that there have been a success. It's worth remembering there have only been 90,000 purple visit, or actually no, slightly more. That's unfair because that was around January. There had been 90,000 purple visits. That works out about one a prisoner, which is nowhere near what we might want. We've also seen the rollout of some in-cell telephony again, which is improving things. So things are getting better. I think we need to watch closely whether this leap in technology that's been made by the prison service in an area where I think there is some instinctive and to some extent understandable nervousness has begun to make some progress. But what I think is important is that they build on this. And I would just add one other thing, which is that what technology mustn't be is a replacement for human to human contact, because and the building of relationships. So there are some things that can be done really well through technology, but there are some things that very definitely can't be done through technology, and building relationships is one of those.
Thank you. Can I just quickly ask you, of the people you deal with high up, what would you say their appetite is to sort of take on public opinion if the view is, well, why are prisoners being given this privilege of access to the internet and Wi-Fi and that sort of prevalent public opinion? Will they just brazen it out?
I think the pandemic's helped to get over that hump to some extent. So I'm probably more confident than I would have been, a couple of years ago, where I remember there was a pilot project at Park YOY to do some digital stuff, and one of the reasons that it made quite slow progress was because people were worried about perceptions of the public. I think things have moved on a bit from that, but I think we need to wait and see. But it will require some political will behind it, in order that when inevitable questions get asked about notorious prisoners, having access to the internet, that ministers follow through and senior prison staff and are able to give assurances that particularly victims of crime will be protected from risk in this process.
Thank you.
Shall I? Cara, is that? Are you able to unmute yourself, or do you have to have it?
Thank you. Yeah, it's Cara. I work for a very small charity called Children Heard and Seen. We support the children of prisoners. And I'm just conscious that in a lot of reports, the section on family and significant others is often very, very tiny. And I'm just wondering about your views on kind of the role of children and families in contributing to a healthy prison. I know I've had experiences where families have been very much able to sort of test the temperature of prisons and have spoken about where there are issues, and then something has happened in a prison. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about the role of children and families.
Yes, I mean, I take your point on the amount of space we give to that, and I think it's always a pressure on us. We have to get lots into a report, and there's always a pressure on space. I get a lot of correspondence from prisoners' families about concerns that they have, and if it's a safeguarding concern, we don't investigate individual claims unless it's something to do with safeguarding, in which case we'll get straight onto the governor and ask for a report on that. We keep these and they go into our risk assessment file. So when we look at, when we're deciding on which prisons to look at, and when we then go and inspect a prison, we will look at the pattern of complaints and correspondence that we've had from parents, family, friends, and often those are quite telling and begin to give us some leads to start to follow. So yeah, I think it's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sam?
Sorry, can I just, I think Val had a question. Which,
oh, sorry, I'm jumping the gun.
Just try to get in, Charlie. So if I just Kevin, go to Val.
Yes. No, indeed, you're right. You're absolutely right.
If Jamie can unmute her, or if Val can unmute herself. There we go.
Hello, okay. Charlie. I represent the Corbett Network, and we focus on getting jobs for ex-offenders. You're coming to talk to our Zoom in a couple of months, but I want to ask you about the power of your being Chief Inspector of Prisons, because your two predecessors, Lord Ramsbottom and Peter Clark, I've had extensive talks with, and Peter was one of our speakers at the Zoom. I just wonder how much you can do, because both of them have told me that exactly the same things they asked for all through these years, and nothing has been done. Nothing has been taken from what they wanted. And they both left, I think, quite disappointed. So how are you going to make any changes at all that will be followed through by government, MOJ?
Well, I think you're right to raise that tricky and challenging question. And I can see in my line of sight David Ramsbottom's book, Prison Gate, And I know that some of the things that are raised in that book are still issues today. And actually, I remember when there was a UN inspection report on Feltham 2 years ago, I happened to be seeing David that day, and he said to me, don't bother to read that report, read my 1997 report on Feltham. So I think it is a frustration of the job. We're not a regulator, therefore we can't make people do stuff. I'm actually comfortable with that because I think it entirely changes the role of the inspectorate. And I think there are inevitable frustrations with this role because stuff doesn't happen at the pace that you'd want it to happen. Nevertheless, I think all chief inspectors would also be able to point to changes that have happened as a result of them being there. And also, I think things that might have happened had they not been there as well. And I think that's critically important as well. But I'm, Val, absolutely in no doubt that there will be some frustrating times ahead. And I will need to gird my loins and be resilient to those as we go.
Thank you.
That's great. So I think we've got time for one last question. And I think someone did have their hands up previously. I'm just scanning now to see if I can see who it was.
Sam Boyd.
Okay.
There's a couple there, I think.
Okay, well, let's go to Sam, and then we'll, if someone can let me know who the other person is, then Victoria. For the final question. So Sam first then, okay?
Thanks so much, Kevin. Hi, Charlie. Thanks for all your answers so far. It's really interesting to hear. I'm Sam. I work at Switchback, and we support young adults returning from prison to London. We provide intensive support in the prison and then continue that in normal times anyway through the gate upon release. So I had a question really about resettlement and how you see the role of prisons in preparing people for release and what you intend to look at in that area. And I guess for us, maybe we kind of see this in two senses. One, in terms of practical preparation, and at Switchback at the moment, we're seeing record numbers released homeless with nowhere to go, also without a bank account, things like an ID, a phone, a benefits appointment, those very practical things that can help people set up upon release. And then secondly, in terms of meaningful one-to-one support in the prison, and I guess it speaks to your point around the mental health impact of the current conditions, but also more broadly, the role that one-to-one support in prison can play, helping people kind of prepare emotionally and practically for success after release from prison. Thanks.
Yeah, and it's particularly acute at the moment, actually, because people are leaving prison and they're really worried about the pandemic as well. They know this terrible thing is raging out there, but they're not even sure whether they're going to be able to get on a train or get themselves home. So it's a big issue. We've worked closely with the probation service, with the probation inspectorate, and Justin and I talk regularly about this. And I do think it's something that is effectively done by both inspectorates collaborating together. But I think you're right. There are two bits to rehabilitation, and I think sometimes people become very focused on the nuts and bolts of resettlement, which is finding somewhere safe to live, getting those practical things sorted, and those are enormously important. But there is also the emotional journey that prisoners need to make in order to really, I think, to think about themselves in a different light, and it's that thing of seeing yourself not as someone who's involved with criminality, someone who's antisocial and a problem, and seeing yourself in a sort of pro-social life as someone who can make a practical difference and feel in control of things. And I think those two things are equally important. And you can do all the practical stuff, but if you don't get the emotional stuff right as well, then you're likely to go wrong. But similarly, the other way around, you get the emotional stuff right, but if people haven't got somewhere safe to live, they will again run into difficulties.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so final question before we close this session goes to Victoria.
Hi, Charlie. My name is Victoria. I'm currently an intern at the Criminal Justice Alliance, as well as being a senior coordinator. Forgot my role there. Senior coordinator at the SOS Plus Girls in Gangs for the SOS Plus service. And I had two questions really. One was mainly the first one, I know that you're not responsible for this, but the first one was wanting to know what your thoughts were regarding the new plans to create 500 new prison spaces for females, and also what you would like to see in terms of improvement for education. You spoke a lot about education, and I know you have an education background. So what you'd like to see in terms of improvement for females within prison?
Thank you. Two very good questions. I think the first thing on the prison places is that we know certainly that there's lots of nervousness and concern and worry about the fact that more places are being made available. I think this is partly on the back of the increased numbers of policing, and I think from our point of view, we wouldn't comment on a policy decision like that. Ultimately, that's for ministers to decide how many prison places they feel they should have. What we will do, though, is to make sure that when those places come on stream, that we will make sure that we are focusing relentlessly on treatment and conditions of women prisoners who are going into those establishments. So whatever we might feel about the policy, that doesn't affect the way that we operate, which is about focusing in on those conditions. And your second question was about education and where it can be improved. We're actually doing some work that the Lord Chancellor has asked us to look at neurodiversity in the secure estate and to do a fairly quick call for evidence. And I think one of my biggest concerns is particularly around the quality of the support that people of which there are a large proportion in prisons with neurodiverse needs, get when they're there. So particularly with things like, as we know, very high numbers of speech language communication difficulties, which are often barriers to people's successful rehabilitation. Also people with learning difficulties and the support that they need. And for example, people on the autistic spectrum, who again, we know are overrepresented in prison. So it's how do you create the sort of education that gives the bespoke support that people need, as opposed to the danger of a sort of generic prisoner-focused one-size-fits-all. Because also at the other end of the spectrum, you have some really high-flying people who end up for whatever reason in prison and have enormous capabilities and are able to go on and make great successes of their lives. And those people too need to be supported and to be taken into account when people are planning education.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, everyone, for your questions to Charlie. And Charlie, thanks for making the time to join us today.
Absolute pleasure.
So I think just one thing I noticed in the chat. What would be the best way for members to perhaps contact yourself, Charlie? Is there a kind of email contact that they might want to use to kind of get in touch with you?
Sorry, I'm muted. We've got the HMI prisons if you look at our website, the email address is there. If you email to that address, stuff that's addressed to me will always get through. So you might not get an instant reply, but we will always respond to any correspondence that we get.
That's great. I think that answers a query from Cara. So thanks very much on behalf of the CJA and members, and I think all of us kind of look forward to working with you in the future, Charlie. So thanks for attending today.
Thank you.
Okay, folks. So we kind of move on to the panel section of our meeting today, which, as I mentioned before, the focus is around mental health of people in the criminal justice system during the pandemic and beyond. And not wishing to prejudge things, I suspect that this might be a little bit gloomy. So I'm hoping that as we have questions and comments, we can perhaps think about solutions and ways we can kind of get around some of the challenges, which I'm sure our panelists will identify. So I'm going to go. So the way we're going to do this is that we're going to hear from all the panelists first. So I think each panelist has got sort of 5 to 10 minutes to just talk about key issues that they are concerned about, and then once everyone's had a chance to have their say, we'll then open it up to kind of questions to everyone. And again, if you've got any queries or questions you'd like to ask, if you can put them in the chat, then that will help perhaps in terms of kind of ordering them. And also it means I don't have to try and sort of scan rapidly across the various screens to see who's got their hands up and who's not. So that would be a real help. So without further ado, I'd kind of like to introduce and welcome Graeme Durkin, who's the Associate Director of Research and Evaluation at the Centre for Mental Health. And Graeme's worked in mental health for quite a few years. I think 40 years, Graeme. I mean, I hope that's not kind of too much of a secret, but 40 years, starting initially as a psychiatric nurse by background. And you spent quite a bit of time at the Centre for Mental Health. And you currently, as I understand it, lead the Centre's work in criminal justice, covering prisons, immigration removal centres, and all sorts of other stuff. So over to you, Graeme, to kind of to give us your sense of where things are at.
Great, thanks. Hi, members. Thanks, Kevin, for that introduction. So I don't need to introduce myself. I will try to share my screen, and you let me know if this is working. And can you see that, folks? I've got some nods, and let me just get it into presentation mode. Fantastic. So that's me. What I wanted to talk really quickly about, because we've only got 5 minutes or so, is mainly the first part of a two-part exercise that I've been involved at or been leading at the centre. So the first part is a national consultation review around the future of mental health. The report is coming out in April, early April, hopefully. I believe the 12th of April we'll be publishing that. The data was collected over last summer, and then we stopped collecting data around October. But it's the first part of a two-part exercise. The second part of the exercise is really a detailed survey that we're going to conduct in all prisons, and we're going to be looking at caseloads at the individual prisoner level on mental health and well-being caseloads, and we've got about 40 questions on each that are going to be sort of completed on each prisoner. We're also going to look at unmet needs. Well, it's a difficult thing to look at, but we're going to try and look at that. We're also then, we'll have something around, the sort of level of needs in prisons, etc., how those are being met, what the teams are like, what the staffing is like, and what skills they have. And then we're also going to look at processes as well. And that will cover health providers, mental health providers, and also the voluntary sector providers. And we'll be doing an exercise related to this as part of this, hopefully with the help of CLINCs, for those services that aren't directly commissioned by the NHS in prisons. Okay, so both of these bits of work are commissioned by NHS England and NHS Improvement. The review, which I'm talking about now, as I say, it wasn't intended to be about COVID. In fact, we intended to launch it around February of last year. COVID hit us, obviously, and so we delayed the launching and opened it up in the summer. But we got around 70 people from different organisations giving us verbal submissions at various events, virtual events that we run, and we got over 100 written submissions, and plus we did a literature review and were supplied with a lot of literature. So hopefully this is moving on screen for you. That's good, thank you, Kevin. So it was a really broad review. I'm not going to go through this. I'm going to leave that on screen for a few more seconds just so you can get some idea. And this is not an exhaustive list. So we put out a call for evidence and suggested these were topics that people could talk about, and people did. So that's grand. I'm now just going to go through some sort of key points that came up. So I'm not doing the report justice. There's a lot more detail behind all this. And there's just some sort of fairly obvious things here, like as far as I'm concerned, and that is a strong feel for everyone who gave evidence is, whilst it might be the NHS's job to provide treatments, etc., a healthy environment, a trauma-informed environment, an environment that maintains well-being is actually the responsibility of the host, so the prison service, HMPPS. That's critical. And it's about, for me, it's about, in order for that to happen, there have to be, it's about understanding those that you're working with. And we've already had that from Charlie's talk, that, the bulk of people that you're working with have some sort of, probably multiple sort of complex vulnerabilities, issues, needs that you're working with. That's the default. It's rare that someone just has one issue that they come in with. It's a host of things. And it's about making reasonable adjustments. So when I'm talking about changes to regimes and practices, services. It's about making reasonable adjustments to the type of people you've got there. People with ADHD, speech and language problems, autism, learning disabilities, so on and so, acquired brain injury, and then personality disorder. All of those people, understanding the issues, understanding those vulnerabilities means you can understand better how they see the world, how they think, how they see you. That's really crucial. And it's also crucial for security as well as for running a sort of a healthy regime. It's no shock to say that I don't think that the workforce in prisons, and that's any workforce going into prisons, but particularly prison staff itself, are actually trained for that task. It requires a major reform. This isn't just about running some mental health awareness sessions. It's about dramatically changing how we train them and the existing workforce too. So that's an important theme that's come up in terms of healthcare and the NHS's job. There's not a massive problem with the model of healthcare. It does need the national specification around mental health care does need updating, does need revising, and we'll be helping with that across our 2 exercises. But actually it's about the commissioning. What is commissioned where? There is huge variability in what's being commissioned. It's especially present around psychological intervention, etc. But there are some settings it's really difficult to commission services for. So large prisons with a large churn, so with a heavy remand prison, let's take Wandsworth, 1,400 or so, about 900 of those people are sort of rapidly churning. It's very difficult to commission in that sort of chaotic setting, especially treatments, etc. And those are the most vulnerable group. The short-term prisoners and those on remand often have the most acute needs. Other things that are very clear is the sort of treatment, care and responses for various neurodiverse issues. It's extremely variable. So there are some wonderful examples in some places, others not so. The other thing we've been talking about already is support on release. And I want to just flag up the Reconnect programme. So this is a programme that will cover the whole of England by, I think it's year 23-24. So there's a number of pilot sites at the moment. It's commissioned by NHS England, and it's about supporting people through the gates and into the community. So some pre-engagement, and it's about working with a complex group. They're still sort of piloting it, who will get that. Sorry, I've jumped ahead there slightly. So I just waved my hand over my mouse, the power we have. So that's really quite important. But what's going to be critical for that to work is for that to integrate with what's happening out there in the community. And it's very hard to get onto mainstream mental health and mainstream healthcare and local authorities as well. So the new sort of reforms in the community are going to bring about integrated care systems which join together health and local authorities. It's absolutely vital that Reconnect connects with those for effective, meeting effective needs. The other thing I wanted to sort of flag up is the white paper on the reform of the Mental Health Act. So just over 2 years after the reform of the Mental Health Act, we have at last got a white paper, which is obviously it's somewhat diluted. But if it's realised in its current form, there should be some major progress. We know we have too many people coming into prison. There are some unnecessary remands. Not all of that is going to be dealt with in the white paper by any means, but certainly some of the remands that magistrate make around concerns over someone's well-being, etc., giving magistrates the same powers as and district judges as judges in Crown Courts to ask for assessments, etc., and for those assessments to be conducted in the right places. That's really, really very critical. But also the white paper makes recommendations around transfers to the NHS for those people who need to be treated under the Mental Health Act. Again, we discuss what's in the white paper. It's really, I would flag this up for people, and also some of the stuff we're saying about bringing people back in. I think for the first time there'll actually be some responsibility and some law and some impact if there are delays in transfer, and then a role for someone to oversee all that. So one more slide. I know I'm racing through this, but I don't want to take up other people's times. So we have heard some positive things about COVID. We did this during the summer, so we were largely hearing about the first lockdown. And I have to say, digitally, whilst us out here I do some work in the community as well, there was lots of things that we were learning about how we will go on using digital. It was largely from, the impression we were given from our evidence, an opportunity lost. There is the possibility actually in the future of providing some psychological need in a much more widespread way through virtual platforms. And really, I think we're starting to do some of the piloting now, but the piloting we were doing out in the community was not happening in the prisons. Lots of light in the tunnel, not just around vaccines, but around digital. NHS England and Stroke Improvement have purchased 2,000 digital licenses plus equipment, which will be going into prisons. So the ability to do assessments and more remote activity is going to be there. The big experience is that activities, visits, time out of cells stopped. And these are, really important for well-being. And that was the general experience. And I know some people have been slow to get back and some people have been faster in sort of adjusting their regimes, but it must have had a massive impact. There was an increase in use in single cells and all for the right reasons to stop the spread of the disease. However, what it effectively means is people were being held in solitary confinement, probably some very clear human rights breaches, etc. We don't know what the longer term impact on well-being. We're waiting to see that. We don't know that in the community. My own organisation is doing sort of predictions and some forecasting around that. And the other thing we've got to bear in mind is there's a current outbreak in the prisons. About 75% of prisons are affected by that. It's much more marked now this second time round than it was in the first lockdown. One of the possible impacts of that, I know we've heard about a reduction in self-harm, but in the last quarter, there appears to have been an increase in self-harm. Now, whether that sustains over the next year, we don't know, but that's gone up about 5%. So we had a reduction, then men's has 5% up on, but for women, it's gone up sort of 24%. And even on the previous year, where generally the stats had gone down, it had gone up about 8-9% for women. So that's something just to flag up. We can't say for certain, but it's likely to be, that COVID and the changes in regime. And of course, COVID hasn't affected us all evenly in the community, and we would expect that in the prison. So we've heard bits and pieces about, certainly I've just possibly women affected, older prisoners affected. We should also accept people from certain Black and Asian communities, perhaps more bereavements in the community have been affected. So the effects won't be even. I've raced through this. I'm going to stop there. I think I've kind of used my time up.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Graeme. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of revisit some of the things you've kind of highlighted there when we come to the kind of open kind of question session. So for now, thanks so much, Graeme. So I'm going to turn to our next panel member and speaker, Soruche Saajedi. Soruche is a prisoner engagement officer at the Prison Reform Trust, and since he's been there, the Prison Reform Trust, he's authored a number of reports, including reports about what incentives work in prison, what do you need to make best use of your time in prison, and how can we reduce tensions, conflict, and violence in prison. So, over to you, Soruche. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on this particular issue.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen so I can get the presentation up. Here we go. I'm going to try my best not to repeat things that have already been said, but I think that's kind of inevitable given the fact we're all basically been doing the same thing over the last 12 months, namely speaking to prisoners. So yeah, I'm Prisoner Engagement Officer at Prison Reform Trust, been working with Paula Harriott, who I'm stepping in for today, mainly on the Prisoner Policy Network, which is a free-to-join membership network for prisoners, ex-prisoners, relatives, and supporting organisations. Like every organisation in the sector, when the pandemic hit, we had to get our thoughts thoughts together, adapt the way we're working, and work out how we were going to go about doing the work that we were doing, which was listening to prisoners and trying to help them influence policy decisions. Luckily, the fact that we had an existing network of, at the time, I think about 850 people in prison, meant that we could get around the obviously ban on visits in prison. We couldn't hold our discussion groups like we would previously, but we could utilize letter writing and services like Email a Prisoner, which, although they're not perfect, have been an absolute godsend for us. So we began in July. We launched Captive as a series of briefings that will give snapshot images of what was going on within prison, in the words of prisoners and family members who communicated to us. We advertised in Inside Time, Converse magazine, and we did some adverts on National Prison Radio as well. Obviously, the response that we were having letters coming into the office anyway before the launch of Captive, but once we did put out the call, the response was pretty overwhelming. We had, I think in total now, we've had close to 400 submissions, I think 300 or so individual service users, quote unquote, who have contacted us, and family members as well. Yeah, 180. So out of the 300 contributions we had, about 180 of them mentioned prison health. Each report was on a different theme, the third one being on health, physical and mental. We had 79 different prisons that were represented in the report. There was also an additional 6 that were unnamed, unidentified. In terms of what life has been like for prisoners, I mean, we all have a pretty good sense of it, but what's come back through Captive is, I mean, we had hundreds of responses, but a lot of them were very similar. They were namely talking about the draconian, very tough regime, 23 hours a day in prison. I mean, we quote that number quite a lot, but in reality, there's people who get locked up on a Friday, they don't get let out until Sunday and Monday. So people are doing significantly more than 23 hours a day sometimes. We already know that the prison system was arguably in crisis before the pandemic hit. Overcrowding in the prison system, people who don't have access to sanitation, don't have access to showers, in-cell phones. At the time of the outbreak of the pandemic was still in less than a third of prisons, I think. And then, so you have people who are carrying existing traumas, maybe are trying to deal with the guilt of prison sentences or feel that they've been wrongly convicted, who are isolated from the family members, locked in a cell with very restricted means of gaining information on what was happening. So you have people who are restricted to whatever newspapers are on the wings that are being allowed to be distributed, and then the free view channels that are available in your cells. I don't know about you guys, but I remember the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, the anxiety levels being through the roof. It was only really when I turned off the television, I stopped watching the constant news cycle, that I started to feel a little bit better. I think in the absence of any distractions, like a prisoner in a prison cell, you'd probably be stuck watching the TV continuously, which would probably feed into your anxiety levels quite a lot as well. Main things that prisoners talked about, apart from obviously the regime, the lack of progression, the lack of social distancing and PPE, the fact that the dynamic within prison had suddenly changed to one where prison officers basically became the main threat to prisoners in terms of infection control. Obviously, they can come and go in and out of the prison, and for the first few months, at least for the evidence that we were getting, we were hearing that staff were not regularly wearing PPE, we're not social distancing. Wings often didn't have, prisoners didn't have ready access to hand sanitizers, to soap, cleaning equipment, cloths. A number of people wrote to us, said, all we have is toilet roll here, we don't even have soap. You have obviously multiple points of, multiple sort of vectors of transmission. So whether it's in narrow corridors, maybe it's doing roll call when you're a meter away from someone else, using a communal phone that isn't being properly wiped down. All of these things are being noticed by prisoners, and the obviously feeding into fears and anxieties because they're well-founded. The impact in terms of mental health. One thing that I've observed is through the course of the last 12 months, obviously a lot of the members of our Prisoner Policy Network have been in contact with us for a while, some of them 2.5 years. So I've sort of got to know a few of them in terms of what they're normally like. And there's an observable sort of deterioration in certainly some of the members, even so far as to essentially we've not been able to continue communicating with some people because the mental health has deteriorated to such a point that really they're not in a position to be able to contribute to consultation work like this in any meaningful sense. So the damage and the harm that's been caused is vast. It's not necessarily a surprise. I mean, there's a few quotes here which I won't read out, but I think they illustrate that point. A major factor being the sort of the sense of a loss of control over your own life. So you know what the threats are. You're reading about all of the latest developments in the news on the TV. You're hearing from your family about, the queues at the supermarkets, the masks everywhere, general fear-inducing events that are happening. But you have very little respite. Whereas some of us could, when things were building up too much, we could go outside for a walk at least, so we could change the scenery a bit, or we could easily contact a loved one, do a Zoom call. That obviously is beyond the means of someone stuck in prison. How can the situation be improved? Well, I think to answer this, we need to first acknowledge the context within which not just the prison service, but wider society has found itself in. So we have a prison service which is obviously very old. Many prisons that are, over 120 years old, 130 years old, decaying, physically are not built for social distancing. They're not good places to contain an infection or an outbreak. You had over a third of prisoners in shared cells. Obviously, many of these cells would have been designed for one person. Staffing levels, which were already very low, staff morale was already very low before the pandemic, taken absolute beating with the onset of this one. So I think at one point, I'm not sure where I saw the stat, but I remember reading, I think maybe April time, that something like a third of prison staff were at home sick or self-isolating. So the impact of that has in terms of staff being able to notice, monitor, record, and respond to mental distress, mental ill health is significant, and we shouldn't forget that. So in terms of when the physical environment is closed, there's not much you can do in terms of expanding capacity. The only route, as far as I can see, that is left is for the prison population to decrease. The early release scheme obviously didn't go as far as we'd like it, anywhere near as far as we would have liked it to. But with the backlog in courts building up, the sort of suspension of courts means that the prison population has reduced slightly. I think at the moment we're at around 77, 78,000 people across the male and female estate. That's significant, but as the courts open up, there's a chance that it's more than likely that that's going to creep back up again significantly. So in terms of what we can do, or what has helped, we've made clear in our report that the types of things that prisoners have said have helped have always been within a context of, this is still a bad situation, but these things help me cope slightly. So things prisoners have said have helped: in-cell phones, even in prisons where we regularly get complaints, calling into our advice line and whatnot, people have mentioned the fact that having the in-cell phone has been a lifesaver. So expanding that across the prison estate surely has to be a given. Obviously exercise when you can go out and do it, but people have been creative, working out how to do exercise routines within their cells. Yoga, creative endeavors. I just read one prisoner talking about the joy of playing guitar in his cell. It does make me wonder how the people in the cells opposite feel about that, but creative outlets certainly help. Reading materials, we've tried our best to send magazines, articles, books where we can to prisoners in our interactions, although that's been greatly restrained. Because obviously when there's an outbreak, you can't really send masses of paperwork to a prison. Also, we've been working from home, so there's a little bit of time adapting to that way of working. Certainly been mention of DVD movie clubs that have been set up in some prisons, mainly through prison chaplaincies that have sort of used this opportunity to innovate their practices, and a lot of prisoners have said good things about that. Good staff relationships and mental health teams that are proactive and regularly check in with people. So these are things that could potentially be done without addressing the wider context within which the prison system sits. But I think it's fair to say that quite a lot of the things that induce anxiety, cause stress, and badly impact people in prison's mental health, the solutions probably exist outside, or will have to exist outside of the prison estate. For example, calling back to Cara's mention of prisoners' families, thinking about prisoners' families who've written to me and said that they're going through their own troubles outside of prison, which are then impacting their loved one within prison. So, for instance, people who are losing their houses, losing their jobs, losing family members. All of this is still going on. In fact, the families are probably statistically more likely to be in those groups that will be losing jobs, losing houses, losing family members. And that is obviously going to have an impact on people in prison as well. Just to finish on this final quote, I won't read it out, but it kind of sums up the mass sort of dread that is contained within the letters that we've received over the last 12 months. I'm sorry, it's not a particularly positive note to end on, but I think it gets to the point that people feel powerless. They don't really have any respite. I mean, we all feel powerless in this pandemic, but they don't really have any means of respite that are available to us. And either any solution out of the current predicament has to involve getting people out of their cells more than 2 hours a day. I'm not really sure. I wouldn't be willing to endorse any policy response, for instance, that maintains prisoners being locked in their cells for most of the day, because I'm not sure that with all the will in the world and the most innovative practices, we'll be able to get around the severe damage that must be doing to people's mental health and well-being. So I'll just leave it there on the dreary note.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Soruche. We'll kind of come back to you, as I say, a little bit later when we go to the kind of questions. So on to our next speaker, and I'd like to welcome Khatuna Tsintsadze from the Zahid Mubarek Trust. Khatuna joined the trust in 2011 and previously spent 15 years working in the NGO sector, both nationally and internationally, I think including a stint at a human rights organization in Georgia. And before we kind of started, she did say, I think I was right in saying, she did say that she was a self-confessed person who thinks of half glass, let's try that again, glass half full kind of a person. I hope I got that right. Anyway, over to you.
That
Khatuna.
is. Thank you very much, Gavin. And that is, and I'm afraid I have to apologize for adding probably extra kind of, negative news about the state of the mental health in prisons. But that's the reality, and I guess we can't escape it. Briefly about the Zahid Mubarek Trust, established by the family of the 19-year-old Zahid, murdered by his racist cellmate on the morning of the release from Feltham Young Offenders Institution. 20 years since Zahid's death, we are still here advocating for racial disparities, for reducing racial disparities in the prison system and providing specialist support to prisoners. Today, I want to talk about the impact of the pandemic on prisoners, prison leavers, and families from ethnic minority communities, and give a platform to those voices. And thank you to the CJA for providing me with this opportunity. We have a long history of working with the communities we represent, but this representation and support have become more critical than ever during the pandemic. Last year, in partnership with other specialist charities, we set up a public campaign to record the impact of COVID-19 on Black, Asian, Irish traveller, Gypsy, and other ethnic minority prisoners. Despite the challenges, the campaign received an impressive number of responses from prisoners, prison leavers, and families. The full findings from this work will be published in the coming months. The campaign focused on several key areas, including the impact on prisoners' mental health, and covers the experiences during the first national lockdown. Since then, we have had further lockdowns in the community, meaning that prisoners and families are experiencing a prolonged period of restrictions as we speak. We are now at a point where we know much more about the mental health impact of lockdown in prisons than we did at the beginning of the pandemic. There is strong and accumulating evidence that the pandemic affects people's mental health differently depending on a number of factors that increase the risk of mental health problems. Many of these factors are present amongst ethnic minority communities, representing 27% of the prison population. What we are dealing with is a shared negative experience on a large scale, and addressing these challenges in a culturally appropriate way requires proper consideration from this service. It is clear that on top of fighting outbreaks and preventing the spread of the virus, prisons face a mental health crisis. Depression, distress, anxiety, insomnia, panic attacks, and anger are just a few issues highlighted to us by prisoners, prison leavers, and families. For example, reports on TV that ethnic minority people were more likely to be affected by COVID-19 was making prisoners more anxious. One prison leaver told us how prisoners on his wing, mostly from ethnic minority groups, were scared for themselves and families. The experience of mental health services by ethnic minority communities has been disproportionately negative, both in community and in custody. Black, Asian, and ethnic minority prisoners are less likely to have their mental health needs identified and less likely to self-report any mental health needs. However, compared to previous years during the pandemic, we have seen a considerable increase in the reporting of mental health issues, including severe mental health complications. Such increased reporting will result in increased demand for mental health services in custody and in the community. We cannot be sure if people are getting the right support at the right time. In the case of some prison leavers, we have noticed that their mental health issues were not picked up prior to release, and they have not been able to access specialist services post-release, and the long-term implications of not having such a specialist support is unknown for their resettlement outcomes. Depression, anxiety, and other issues reported during lockdown can lead to severe complications for individuals and establishments. The loss of social visits, the lack of meaningful contact with others due to reduced time out of cell, all of this reduce the social support needed to mitigate against and cope with mental distress and the risk of suicide and self-harm. This lack of social support also gives the rise to risk of maladaptive coping strategies, such as drug taking, and some prison leavers told us how easy it was to access drugs during the lockdown. A few weeks ago, we spoke to a family whose loved one self-harmed after a prison did not respond to several requests for help. They told us that often those with pre-existing mental health issues are prioritized, and they feel that prisons, exhausted from fighting the pandemic, do not have adequate capacity to identify and support all prisoners, regardless of their pre-existing needs. This only serves to compound the existing negative experience of mental health services, as discussed earlier. We found that the availability of practical support is not consistent, and many prison leavers and families speak about in-cell pack fatigue. This support, effective at the beginning of the pandemic, has slowly been losing its desired impact, particularly for prisoners from Gypsy, Roma, and tribal communities who feel that their specific needs were not taken into account. In going forward, there has to be a long-term strategy for promoting mental well-being, both during and after the pandemic. We hope that BME-led and BME specialist charities are involved in co-designing this plan in order to increase engagement and trust from ethnic minority prisoners. It has been mentioned by the previous speakers, and in my view, there is no doubt that the necessary measures to reduce virus transmission are not without cost, and the long-term effect of their consequences is unknown. We need careful, urgent, and transparent analysis to establish an informed collective solution to minimizing physical and mental harm and saving lives. Thank you.
That's great. Many thanks for that, Khatuna. So we'll kind of come back to some of the issues you've raised when we have the kind of Q&A session. But for now, I'd like to welcome Paul Kastman, who's the director of Changing the Game. And Paul's had over 25 years experience of the community and criminal justice sector, spending 4 years as a senior policy lead for gangs and serious youth violence at the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime in London. And in 2013, he set up Changing the Game, which is an organization that delivers therapeutic group programs to address trauma and identity amongst African Caribbean men who are in prison. So over to you, Paul.
Hi, thanks very much. I hope you can all hear me okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you. And I'm going to be brief because the problem of following such a good panel is they've already said all the good stuff. So there's no point me rehashing what's already been said. And what I really wanted to do when I was thinking about the presentation and kind of putting together some material was actually look at, rather than the impact of COVID, what was the state of play in terms of how do we address and thinking about mental health in the prison system currently. And so if you look at most of the data, most of the reports, the National Audit Office had a report on mental health in prisons in 2017, I think it was, and there was a House of Commons report that looked at the same issue in October of 2017. The top lines that we look at are things like suicide and self-harm as indicators of the state of mental health of prisoners. And beyond that, if we're looking at mental health provision, we start thinking about schizophrenia, the more acute psychiatric issues, psychoses, and then maybe moving into personality disorder spectrum issues. We've got lots of work around the PD pathway taking place. And in a lot of the prisons, that would really give us, if we looked at all of those issues, we're probably looking at 5 to 10% of the prison population who would fall under that remit. And I think there was some data which showed, I think NHS England, that at any one time, 10% of prisoners are receiving some type of intervention to address mental health in the prison system. So would that lead us to believe that the other 90% of prisoners are doing fine and don't have any problems? So if we're really going to think about designing needs-led environments, developing a needs-led culture and commissioning interventions in that way, how are we actually thinking about mental health if that's what our focus is? And what happens if we start moving towards the understanding that we have in the community about mental health, which is mental well-being? So we've started conversations and we're moving the conversation towards thinking about adverse childhood experiences, trauma informed approaches, and clearly starting to prioritize more issues around mental well-being. And I remember when I was working in the policy world, there was a real shortage of data which actually mapped the needs of high-risk young offenders. And so anybody that's worked in the youth justice system may be aware of ASSET, the risk management system. We look at the young person's life and look at all the positive things in that person's life that can support them forward. And we also look at the negative risk factors which might influence them towards further criminality. And it's pretty exhaustive. And there's one box that's ticked by practitioners for every young person coming into the youth justice system, which assesses, does this young person have unmet mental health or psychological issues, emotional or psychological issues? And that box for the 300 young offenders that we looked at in 7 boroughs was ticked for 66% of young offenders. So 2/3 of high-risk young offenders had a recognised unmet emotional or psychological need. Drilling down even further, lots of the anecdotal stories that you hear were represented. So 1 in 3 of the sample group had been exposed to domestic violence. 30% had suffered a bereavement of a close family member, maybe a parent or a sibling. Issues around abuse, that could be physical abuse, emotional abuse, and we very rarely speak about sexual abuse, but it does happen. And then other issues around impaired parenting, so parents affected by drug misuse, alcohol misuse, or mental health. So, and those issues never come in ones, they normally come in bunches. So if we're able to start thinking about people who end up in prison as usually having had to deal with a range of these issues, and if we're now starting to think about adverse childhood experiences as a risk factor or risk indicator for criminality, we also understand these are also indicators for poor mental health. So what do our services look like in terms of being able to meet the needs of these young people? And how do we accommodate that element of the mental health conversation in a prison environment? So I think that's the real challenge that we have. If we have a prison culture which prioritizes discipline, control, power, good order, good behavior, obedience, compliance, but actually what we understand is we have a community of people whose formative years have impacted them psychologically, emotionally, that have deeply impacted their view of the world, their view of themselves, their ability to manage their emotions, etc. And who will actually communicate a lot of their distress through violence. They're hardwired to finding maladaptive strategies for keeping safe, locked in a kind of sense of survival. How are we able to actually swing things around and start actually creating an environment and a culture which really is needs-led? We talk about needs-led interventions, needs-led commissioning, but if we're only focusing on preventing suicide and self-harm or schizophrenia and addressing personality disorder issues, there's a whole pool of unmet need that we really need to start thinking about. And the National Audit Office really pick up on this in terms of mapping the mental health delivery and services, what is actually being delivered. We don't currently count what's being delivered. We don't count its effectiveness, and we don't count its continuity. So there's already pre-COVID a real range of issues that we need to start thinking about. And I think also bearing these things in mind when we're developing our COVID response and looking at actually, you know, what our regimes are going to look like. I think the sense is that a lot of this is going to be permanent. So, and I think we need to bear in mind there's a saying among some of the prison officer community, happiness is door-shaped, and they're happier behind their door. Because they don't feel so scared of trouble or bullying or violence in the prison setting, but actually in the groups that I work with. So a lot of the issues that I've spoken about when we run our therapy groups, all of these issues do come out around the traumas that the young men have faced growing up. On top of that, if you're an angry young man in a city in London, in a poor area, probably the best place for you to be is in a gang, because that allows you to get out all of that anger and violence and aggression, gives you a sense of status, and also gives you a chance to solve some financial problems by getting hold of some money. So they're also exposed to unspeakable trauma in terms of the knife and gun crime that we read about. And if we really think that locking someone in behind a door in a small room for 23 hours a day with all of those issues is going to help to rehabilitate them, we really need to start having some really serious conversations. So a lot of the issues that come up in our groups are that these young men are very sleep disturbed, and in the broader community, we see that as a marker of poor mental health. A lot of people are talking about the impact of lockdown in affecting our sleep patterns. These young men in prison can't sleep. They don't sleep because their brains are fried. Lots of them report flashbacks, some voice hearing as well, which are all really extreme symptoms of PTSD. And at initial screening, because these young men are so resilient and because they've developed such strong coping strategies, none of these are picked up as mental health issues at their initial health screenings. So I'm bearing in mind, I'm probably coming to the end of my time. I've got a few more things to say, but I think I'm going to really start to wrap up. So I think that the key thing to really think in mind, I'd like to point people towards Lucy Johnston's work. I don't know if anybody's aware of the power, threat, meaning framework, which has emerged, which has started to point people away from diagnoses and labels. It's very easy to give somebody a diagnosis. They've got a conduct disorder, they've got ADHD, they've got Asperger's, they've got anger management problems, and we then address the diagnosis or the label, and we fail to ask, what is this young person's experiences? What has led this person to this point? What has life taught this person that causes them to behave in the way that they behave, or to have such little control over their emotions and their impulses? And I think with a lot of people in prison, they're now inured to being given labels. They've been given lots of labels on their journey through schools, school exclusion, pupil referral units. They're used to being the bad kid or the problem child, or you're going to be just like your dad. So actually, how can we start to understand violence or particular behaviors as a communication? And again, getting prison officers whose primary job isn't to understand these men. Their primary job isn't to give them counselling, it's to make sure that control, order and discipline is made. And as Khatuna was saying, a lot of the behaviours are maladaptive survival strategies. They're locked in a permanent state of threat response. And actually, how can we make that shift? So I'd like to also just raise two other issues to think about. The Lammy Review a couple of years ago highlighted young BME prisoners are less likely to be recorded as having problems such as mental health or troubled family relationships, suggesting many have unmet needs in the prison system. So again, it's also bearing in mind additional barriers to effective engagement. So we need to think about unconscious bias, implicit assumptions. Prison mirrors broader society in how we treat Black men. So society in general tends to exaggerate a sense of threat coming from Black men and to fail to see their needs or engage with their feelings or their distress. So again, in the prison setting, we need to start thinking about how we're going to have these conversations and start developing services and developing a culture which is able to have these conversations. They're not comfortable conversations. They're very unpopular conversations, or have been up to now, but we still need to have them. It's interesting in my groups, because my groups are for Black men. I'm usually the lightest person in the room, and I'm very aware today I'm probably the darkest person in the room. So again, something for us to think about as a sector. And then finally, the last point I really wanted to raise was also bearing in mind the mental health of prison staff and prison officers. It's a very testing environment. If you're going to think about it from a psychiatric perspective, you know, which Graeme would be coming from, it's a very sick environment, you know, because it holds, you know, a lot of really bad stuff, and everybody's trying to cope. So it's very difficult to be vulnerable. So it's understanding that actually we also need to safeguard prison officers mental health, which will allow them and give them the tools to then engage with the mental health of the prisoners, and actually an indicator of prison officer mental health is also reflected in concerns around suicide among prison officers, which we shouldn't ignore. So I'll wrap up there. I think that's our 10 minutes. I'm sure that people have got interesting comments and contributions to make. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that Paul, and thanks to, in fact, to all four speakers. Okay, so if we can kind of throw it open, really, I guess, to members, to if they have any questions that they'd like to raise or comments they'd like to make. If you can indicate by raising your hand, I'll try and spot you if I can, and then we'll kind of bring you into to the conversation. Just okay.
Jackie at Community Chaplaincy.
Okay. Yes. Sorry, I missed that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm Jackie Oglethorpe. I'm Chair of Trustees for the Community Chaplaincy Association, and I am a therapist. I previously worked in a Cat B jail as a prison counsellor. And I just want to thank everybody for their comments and their input this afternoon. It's been really helpful to me just to kind of get my head re-challenged and refocused. But I particularly want to think about a couple of things. Just to let you know that Community Chaplaincy, we're an umbrella organisation. We represent a lot of projects across the country who support prisoners and their families through the gate and out into the community. But I don't really want to focus on that today. I'd like to go back to what Graeme was saying earlier, if I may, and particularly about the recommendation in his report to the major reform of training for staff in prisons. Certainly something that really echoes in my experience of working in a Cat B jail. So I just want to ask, what are the short, medium, and maybe even long-term recommendations that you would like to see to improve training, specifically in relation to mental health training for prison officers? And how can we ensure that the MOJ take action on those recommendations? Okay. And so I suppose, and there's a kind of second bit to that point, which is, are there any recommendations for improving clinical supervision for prison staff, similar to the required support that as a therapist, in private practice, I have to have, and I benefit from tremendously. And certainly in my experience, felt that was a massive deficit, and links back to what Paul was saying about the mental health of prison officers there. Long question, sorry, but that's it.
Great, thanks for that. So if Graeme can, there you go, Graeme.
Hi there, I wasn't sure if I could unmute myself, but I have been able. Thanks very much for that. I'll do it in reverse order. We don't make a specific recommendation about clinical supervision, but it's because we've kind of kept it to about 10 recommendations that we want, which are broad theme, but we do talk about that in the report. And it struck me a few years ago when we was doing work with the Howard League, some joint work with them. We had no questions or particular interest at that time about, staff well-being. It was one of the big findings that we were looking at, sort of, what might reduce when suicides were getting to that record level just a couple of years, 2-3 years back. That's what was our interest. We were primarily interested in prisoners, but we started talking about sort of staff well-being. Now, if you're in a mental health team, you get monthly clinical supervision. There's a national standard around that, and so you get an opportunity, and there's probably more than one opportunity in a month. There'll be peer supervision, there'll be clinical supervision when you're in, which is great. Prison officers don't get that. So if there's a major incident, there might be a debrief, like there would be in any job, but that's it. So that's something that I think comes out really strongly. They require this just as much. And I think that's part of the culture change. I didn't mention that, but that's something that both training and supervision are things that will gradually get you there. It is interesting, not all prisons are bad. some prisons are better. Funnily enough, smaller prisons and often women's prisons where we see attitudes are somewhat different. And we know in certain units, so we mentioned the personality disorder program, the offender personal. So for that minority of staff that work in those units, the issue of training and supervision is largely dealt with, and we just need to spread that out. Going to your other question around sort of training, the training agenda is massive, because I think your prison officer ought to know lots about personality disorder, also lots about acquired brain injury, because they're, you know, lots and lots about ADHD, because those are really highly prevalent and don't often make it through to sort of mental health teams and so on and so forth, as well as the broad range of sort of mental health problems, depressions, anxiety, as well as the severe end of stuff, and also stuff about autism and all of the things we've kind of covered. That ought to be covered in basic training. I'm not sure I've got it worked out in my head what are the short, medium and long, but I just think, you know, a commitment now, and we are actually hopefully taking this to the Ministry of Justice. We've got the backing of NHS England behind this. We are going to be speaking to the Minister for Justice as well shortly on this, but I think it is just about getting this agenda recognised. I don't think anyone at HMPPS and the Ministry of Justice is going to say that they're not responsible for well-being and all that sort of stuff, but it is going to be quite a battle to get them into changing, you know, into real actions. But it is a sort of a major reform of the basic training, and then looking at the existing workforce and what can we do, and making that mandatory. That's the only way. And of course, we've talked about leadership. It's got to be led from the top, and it's got to translate all the way down.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Graeme. Yeah, absolutely agree with all of that. And I'm just looking forward and hoping that it will come to fruition. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks for that question, Jackie, and also thanks, Graeme. So questions from any other participants? Again, I'm just trying to madly scan across to see whether I can see anyone with a raised hand or raised eyebrow, or it feels like an auction thing, doesn't it? Or anything like that. Anyone's got. Okay, I don't think I can. Oh, hang on, sorry. Yep, someone did have a raised hand, and I kind of missed it, I think. I don't know. Was that Paul? Did you want to come in? No. Okay, all right. So,
Kevin, can I just
yeah, sure.
Just to clarify what I was really interested in what Paul and Khatuna were talking about in particular, about kind of culturally, you know, relevant services, and you know, and obviously Paul's, you know, was one of our award winners for our Criminal Justice Alliance Awards for his, you know, work. Wondered if others were aware of any other sort of examples of good practice or things in the community that we could draw on in terms of, you know, highlighting what good looks like in sort of culturally appropriate services. And in particular, Khatuna mentioned around, you know, Gypsy Roma traveller communities as well. If there's anything else that's been done in the community that we could, you know, sort of say to, you know, the prison service should be being tried or sort of piloted or rolled out within our prisons.
Okay. Any thoughts from anyone? Any ideas or any initiatives that people are aware of that they may wish to raise during the meeting? Or if not, yeah, feel free to perhaps email Nina and Jamie afterwards if it kind of comes to you. Okay. I can't see anything at the moment. So what I'm going to suggest is that perhaps if we just go around the speakers one last time, and if each of the speakers might want to just identify one thing. I mean, I know it's a narrowing it down somewhat. There's one thing that you feel could actually make quite a difference. What would that be? And perhaps you just want to just highlight what that one thing would be. So if I can go to you first, Paul, is that all right? If you...
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think for me, you know, I'm always, well, I'm going to be greedy. I'm going to go for two things.
Okay, sure.
I'm quite big on culture, you know, because we can have all sorts of initiatives and programs and things that, you know, workshops and things that run for a couple of months. But if we're not able to actually shift, you know, the actual DNA of an institution, a lot of the time, you know, they kind of run out of steam. And I think the other thing would really be much more robust data, because in terms of mental health, we're relying on self-reporting, or we're relying on people having some type of crisis before we get involved. And actually, I think actually if we reversed it and understood that if we have people who are very problematic in terms of their behavior, that it is very probable that there is some type of underlying mental health need, or some type of trauma in their background. So I think we could be a lot more effective in actually quantifying that and making more of a business case for more needs-led commissioning.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go to Khatuna next, Soruche, and then come back to Graeme for the final kind of thought. So over to you, Khatuna.
Thank you. I would say start by implementing Graeme's report, the recommendations, which probably will say everything we all, thinking that are the right ones. I would say one thing probably would be as a request that please co-design it together with the charities who represent the communities overrepresented in the prison system.
Sure.
And the last one is just frustrating that we don't have such plan and strategy in place 12 months after the pandemic. And we have to, I would say, probably conversation with Graeme should have been happened about 6 months ago and be ready now as, community restrictions isn't. But, well, it's never late. So I hope that this goes well and we will be all just waiting for better results. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Thanks, Khatuna. And Soruche? Got a final thought from yourself?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, it was just if you had a kind of one thing that you can perhaps identify that you'd hope could change or you'd like to see changed. You may have several, but if you can kind of focus on one.
Okay, within prison, okay, I'll park aside getting people out of cells. Family contact just has to be restored. Obviously, I can't comment on how that would look because I'm not a public health expert, but I want to see that as a priority. I want to hear that announced by ministers that they're prioritizing it. And actually, if I could just suggest one small gesture that could go some way to alleviating some concerns would be prisons minister writing to every person in prison, laying out what the next 6 months is going to look like. At least what their priorities are. Just give people some sort of sense that they are being noticed and work is going on behind the scenes to address this crisis.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. Thanks for that, Soruche. And back to you, Graeme, for the final point.
Okay, I'm not really good at identifying single points, so I'm going to echo the data sort of request from Paul.
Okay.
We're going to be doing some of that in our second act, but it's not entirety. But it's really important and connecting up different bits of data. There's something around more effective screening but just not at reception. There's something about screening all the way through. And the last thing I'd say, I like the idea about co-design and co-production. And I think if you're going to design services that are culturally appropriate in all the senses of that word, you need to co-produce those with the communities. And so that's going to be, it's the charities and it's also some of those people inside prison from a variety of communities. Co-production, some of the best things I've seen in the community in this field have been thoroughly, genuinely co-produced and have had great results. So I'll stop it there.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Graeme. So we'll draw this part of the meeting to close. So thanks very much to all the speakers, panel speakers, and to the questions we've had and the various comments that have come through. So I'm going to hand over to Nina to, I guess, provide us with an update in terms of your director's report before we kind of close. So over to you, Nina.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. So yeah, I just want to say a really big thank you to Charlie Taylor and all our speakers, Paul, Soruche, Graeme and Khatuna for such a thought-provoking set of observations and your expertise today. And just in terms of next steps, we'll use the content from today's meeting to continue to push for something we've pushed for since the beginning of the pandemic, which, as Khatuna mentioned, was this idea of a kind of actual published sort of, strategy and plan about mental health and well-being, and we'll continue to work with the speakers and our members to continue to push on that. And I think that idea of a letter that you mentioned, Soruche, was just a brilliant one, so we'll definitely push for that too.
I stole that idea off a colleague, by the way.
But it's a really good one, and we'll certainly take up all the things that have been discussed this, and this will be something ongoing that the CJA will be sort of looking at, and I think it's a really vital area. Just wanted to pick up a few things that have happened since our last members meeting. So actually, since our last members meeting, we had something really positive, which was our annual awards, which was at the end of last year. If you haven't caught it, if you weren't able to attend, we do have it on our YouTube channel and on our website, so I do really recommend you kind of watching it. There was some, as well as Paul, there were some other really great individuals and organisations that throughout the pandemic have been doing some fantastic and kind of innovative work. So so that was a real sort of highlight. We've continued to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I sit on the Reducing Reoffending Third Sector Advisory Group on COVID, which I've been contributing sort of weekly throughout this pandemic, along with other members. We had Jill Attrell and some of her colleagues from HMPPS speak to members just before Christmas about our Routes to Recovery report, where we had over 60 of our members sort of contribute recommendations and good practice, and we're hoping to organise another one of those sessions shortly. We've been working with our remand expert group, raising concerns about the lack of bail information services in courts and prisons and the impact of the extended custody time limits about people on remand. We received a response from Joe Farrer from HMPPS about our responding restoratively to COVID-19 briefing, about using restorative approaches in terms of this, building back. And I think this idea of co-production really kind of fits in with this idea of restorative approaches. So will certainly be something that we'll, sort of continue to sort of push for. As many of you know, that there was a sentencing white paper that was published without any formal consultation at the beginning of this year. So we quickly gathered together 16 of our members to have put a response into that, highlighting some of the positive areas, but also a lot of areas where we had concerns or where we thought there'd been missed opportunities. I'm meeting with the Bill Committee along with Equal in a week or so's time to feed in on that, in particular focusing on the equality impact assessment for that white paper that shows the disproportionate impact of many of the new provisions on Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. So we'll continue to be working on that, and we've actually got a group of members that are meeting every Friday morning, and we're talking about particularly the race disparity impact and how we can highlight that more, both in terms of the white paper and a lot of very worrying police reforms that are also having disproportionate impacts. As many of you know, the Police and Crime Commissioner elections were delayed by a year, but they're going ahead on the 6th of May. So our Policy Officer Amal Ali is working with Centre for Justice Innovation and some of our other members to refresh our Police and Crime Commissioner briefing. So that'll be out in a few weeks' time. And I'd really urge members to use that briefing to kind of speak, via Twitter or, social media or other things to their candidates in their local areas to ask them, what their views are on some of the topics within that briefing, and to use them to support their new PCC candidates after May in developing their police and crime plans. So hopefully that would be a useful resource for our members and for new PCCs. And just briefly, as many of you know, we have 3 cross-cutting systemic work streams. So the first is about effective scrutiny and accountability. And Victoria, who you will have heard answer a question earlier, has been working with us on two new projects we've got started with the Independent Monitoring Boards and the Independent Custody Visiting Association, focused on improving community scrutiny of race and gender issues in police and prison custody. So we're really grateful to have Victoria working with us on that. Our Stop and Scrutinise report was mentioned in the Mayor of London's new policing action plan, and I was actually on a meeting this morning with Sophie Linden and others as part of a sort of holding to account against that plan and improving community scrutiny and reducing disproportionality amongst the Met Police. At the end of this month, at the end of March, we're going to be launching a report around Section 60 suspicionless searches and calling for a national body to support the scrutiny of stop and search. Our second thematic area is restorative criminal justice system. We've had some real successes working with the Victims Commissioner, our restorative expert group and others to influence the Victims Code. particularly about access to restorative justice and also access to services for Black, Asian and minority ethnic victims. And we're continuing to work with the Victims Commissioner around the Victims Law, again, on both those areas to ensure that the Victims Law also gives those a priority. And our third cross-cutting theme finally is a fit for purpose and diverse workforce. Our lived experience expert group met just before Christmas with the probation workforce strategy team. You'll have heard Lucy Fraser talk about the fact that they're committed to recruiting 200 people with lived experience into the probation service. So our lived experience expert group provided some advice about that. And they also spoke to the Going Forward to Employment scheme, which is a civil service recruitment scheme that recruits, well, they originally just recruited people that were in prison, but now, at our suggestion, they're now recruiting people on license as well. So it's good to see those criteria kind of expanded. So some really good work going on about how you can get more people with lived experience in the criminal justice system working in roles and in leadership roles within our system as well. And just a final plug, tomorrow is the final day for people to fill in our members survey. So you would have received some emails from Jamie, our comms officer. So this is the first time we've had an external evaluation of the CJA. So we really want to hear your views about, what value we've added, what more you want us to see, what you want us to focus on in the future, what other speakers you might like to appear at events like this, what policy issues, you think we should be focusing on in the future. It would be really, really helpful for us to sort of understand our impact, what more that we could do, and what areas we should be focusing on for our next strategy as well. So just a real plug. It should take about 10 minutes to fill in. I know everyone's really, really busy, but we'd really, really value people's time in completing that. And you could possibly win a £50 voucher if you fill it in as well. So bit of bribery is always good. But that's it for me. Just to say, if anyone's interested in joining any of our expert groups or following up on any of the work that we're doing, please don't hesitate to email me or Jamie or Amal at our team. And yeah, we'd love to get more people involved. And here's the link to the survey that Jamie's just put in the chat. Thank you very much, everybody.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Nina. And as you say, just the final plug about the survey. The survey link is in the chat that Jamie's put in, and hopefully you'll receive an email about it over the last couple of weeks. So please do complete that. We really would like to hear your views. I guess it's just falls to me to just thank everyone for attending today. Thank the speakers again for some really insightful and wide-ranging input, and also for members attending for their questions. Thanks so much to Nina and Jamie for kind of putting it all together as ever, and giving me nudges at the right time to kind of say the right things. Very helpful. So look forward to seeing you at the next members meeting, which will be, I guess, in a couple of months' time, I think. We'll probably send the notice out at that point. In the meantime, keep well, and we hope to see you at the next meeting. So have a good rest of the day. Cheers. Bye, everyone.